September 26, 1983. Along the waters of Newport, Rhode Island, a stunned crowd watches as a yacht slices across the finish line of a seventh and deciding race. Flying from its stern, a boxing kangaroo. The yacht is Australia 2. And in that moment, its skipper John Bertrand does the unthinkable. He breaks a 132-year American winning streak in the America's Cup. But the man behind this victory isn't on the water. He's a brash property tycoon from Perth, the financial force behind the entire campaign. His name is Alan Bond, a rags-to-riches success story who overnight becomes a national hero. And within a decade, he'll be behind bars. Born in London in 1938, Alan Bond immigrated to Fremantle in 1950, just 11 years old. It was clear early on he was never going to be an academic, but he didn't lack ambition. His father once predicted he would either end up in jail or become the richest man in Australia. As a boy, he watched his once fit father return from World War II on a hospital train. That moment lit something inside him, the determination to build a better life, not just for himself, but for his family. At 14, he dropped out of school. On his father's advice, he channeled his talent for drawing into a signwriting apprenticeship. It would be the first and last time he worked for someone else. Just 3.5 years later, he quit before even completing his apprenticeship and started a rival business. Not everyone would have called it bold. Some might have called it ruthless. And that distinction would matter later. It was the first of many moves that would eventually make him one of the richest men in the world. In 1959, Alan founded the Bond Corporation. His focus quickly shifted from signwriting to something far more lucrative: property. He was a natural salesman, charming, persuasive, relentless. But his approach came with an edge: aggressive, highly leveraged, and increasingly risky. In 1960, he borrowed £13,000, roughly $500,000 in today's money, to buy 5 acres in the Perth Hills, then committed to 2 more blocks before the first had even sold. The debt wasn't cleared, the plan wasn't proven, but Bond moved anyway, and that became his signature: move first, figure it out later. When he bid on what would become Bond Corporation's future headquarters in Perth, he hadn't even secured the deposit. And yet, time and time again, it worked. Through the 1960s, he became one of Western Australia's largest borrowers. Banks kept lending, Bond kept building. By 29, he'd made his first million, and through the 1970s and 80s, that momentum exploded. Mining, media, hotels, telecommunications. If there was an opportunity, Bond wanted in. Then came the move that would define him. He acquired Castlemaine Tooheys, giving him control of nearly half of Australia's beer market, and making him the 5th largest beer producer in the world. But ownership wasn't enough. Bond wanted visibility, control, dominance. He replaced Queensland's iconic 4X sign at the Milton Brewery with a Bond Corporation one, and gave the beer labels a corporate facelift to match. The backlash was immediate. Proud Queenslanders pushed back, and Bond was forced to retreat. But with the people pouring his beer, he didn't. Hoteliers saw payment terms slashed from 30 days to just 7. And in New South Wales, Bond Corporation fought to let leases expire without renewal and without compensation for goodwill. It wasn't just aggressive anymore, it was ruthless. and it was starting to make enemies. But in the fast money, deregulated boom of the 1980s, it worked. Bond became a billionaire, and as his wealth grew, so did his ambition. By 1987, he launched Bond University, Australia's first private university, and purchased the Nine network for $1 billion. Bond wasn't just successful anymore, he was untouchable. Before the billion-dollar deals, before the empire reached its peak, there was one defining pursuit: the America's Cup. In 1974, Alan Bond launched his first challenge, entering a competition long dominated by wealthy American yachtsmen. Their yacht, Southern Cross, was no match. The Americans won comfortably, their 120-year grip on the cup unshaken. But Bond didn't walk away. He doubled down, not just because he wanted to win, but because he believed he could. And more than that, he saw an opportunity. In 1977, his next campaign became a marketing machine. His luxury development, Yanchep Sun City, would host the challenge, turning the race into a showcase for his growing empire. It was classic Bond, ambitious, audacious, and risky. The result? Another loss on the water. In 1980, he tried again, another defeat. 3 attempts, 3 failures. For most, that would be the end. For Bond, it was a setup. The real attempt was still to come. And in 1983, everything changed. Australia 2 took to the water and set the sailing world alight with its now legendary winged keel, a design shrouded in secrecy. The Aussies had found the edge. The yacht became a symbol, the boxing kangaroo an icon, and this time they won. The Americans' 132-year dominance was broken. Bond had done the unthinkable, but this wasn't the peak of his power, just the peak of his image. And the post-race press conference, he made sure the world saw it, dramatically revealing the keel that changed everything. It wasn't just victory, it was theatre. Back home, Bond was awarded the Order of Australia, his status as a national hero now official, untouchable, unstoppable. But with the spotlight now fixed firmly on him, the fall would be just as dramatic. The America's Cup victory proved one thing: Alan was fearless. His business empire proved another. He had an enormous appetite for risk. But those same traits were a double-edged sword, because Bond's success wasn't just built on deals, it was built on debt, and not small amounts. In the years leading up to his first America's Cup challenge, Bond Corporation's revenue increased 12-fold, its borrowing 20-fold. By 1974, the company was carrying $100 million in debt, around $1 billion in today's money. Bond was always willing to bet big, especially when the money wasn't his. And in the freewheeling boom of the 1980s, banks were more than happy to oblige, so Bond gambled bigger. Behind the headlines, he was building something fragile, a corporate structure so complex it was hard to see where the risk actually sat. Debt was shifted, repackaged, rolled forward. As long as the deals kept coming, the system held. The problem was, they had to keep coming. But even Bond could see the pressure building, so he went hunting for stability. Not smaller risks, bigger ones. In 1981, he acquired the Swan Brewery, locking down Western Australia. Then in 1985, he made his boldest move yet. Castlemaine Tui's, $1 billion play to dominate Australia's beer market. and secure the steady cash flow his empire desperately needed. But inside the business, things were tightening. Bond wasn't a details man. He was vision, momentum, scale. Execution was left to his executives, and they were expected to keep up, because when the bets were this big, getting it wrong wasn't an option. By 1987, Alan Bond and the Bond Corporation had reached their peak. He controlled vast swaths of the Australian economy, dominating the beer market, owning the Nine network, becoming one of the world's largest gold producers, even opening Bond University. In the 1980s alone, he bought, sold, and reshaped 26 companies. In a booming market, there was no more aggressive force than Bond, a man who didn't just play the game, but seemed to consume it. But confidence was beginning to tip into overreach, and beneath the surface, the empire was already straining. In his push into the American beer market, Bond paid $1.26 billion for the G. Heilman Brewing Company, a price some believed was 3 times its true value. Then he doubled down, pouring millions more into expansion, even as Black Monday sent shockwaves through global markets. Bond kept borrowing. Then, in 1988, the move that would change everything. Bond acquired the Bell Group for $685 million. On the surface, it looked like another masterstroke, but the real prize wasn't the company, it was what sat beneath it. In June 1988, the company announced spectacular results. Profits up 70%, revenue doubled. But behind the headlines, the reality was far more fragile. Debt had climbed to $5.7 billion, and the cash flow to support it wasn't there. Only a third of revenue came from stable, income-generating businesses: brewing, hotels, liquor. The rest, one-off deals, asset sales, currency plays. Money that couldn't be relied on to return. And internally, the outlook was worse. Forecasts pointed to a looming cash crisis, hundreds of millions in the red. By October 1988, debt had surged to $7 billion, and time was running out. What happened next would decide everything. So Bond made a move few could see, and even fewer understood. The one that would ultimately bring everything undone. Within weeks of taking control of Bell Group, money began flowing out of the subsidiary Bell Resources, not in simple transfers, but through a web of complex back-to-back loans. In just months, $2.5 billion was drained, around $1.3 billion redirected into the Bond empire, used to pay debts, fund deals, keep the machine alive. To the outside world, Bond still looked unstoppable, but not everyone believed it. In late 1988, during Bond's attempted takeover of the British conglomerate Monroe, its chairman Tiny Rowland struck back. He released a damning 93-page report describing Bond Corporation as technically insolvent. And for the first time, someone said it out loud. The accusation sent shockwaves through the market. Confidence cracked, investors hesitated, and once the illusion broke, there was nothing left to hold it together. By mid-1991, Alan Bond's empire was finished. Bond Corporation formally declared bankruptcy. Assets were sold off, desperately, to claw back billions in debt. But it wasn't enough. Debt only fell to $3.1 billion, and the business that remained was hollowed out. By June, revenues had collapsed 96%. In just 9 months, the company had lost more than $500 million. The empire that had once expanded at breakneck speed was now being dismantled piece by piece. The jewels were the first to go. The Nine Network sold back to Kerry Packer for a fraction of what Bond had paid. Then came everything else: breweries, energy assets, mining interests, overseas ventures, each sale stripping away another layer, until there was almost nothing left. But the financial ruin was only the beginning, because the real damage hadn't been exposed yet. Some of Bond's deals weren't just risky, they were illegal. By early 1992, former executives were being charged by regulators. In April, Bond himself was declared personally bankrupt, unable to repay a $194 million loan. Investigations were closing in, creditors were circling, and behind the scenes, authorities were uncovering a web of complex structures, hidden flows of money, and questionable decisions. In May 1992, it finally caught up with him. Not in a boardroom, but in a courtroom. Bond was found guilty of business dishonesty. Years earlier, during the collapse of Rothwell's Merchant Bank in Western Australia, he had convinced businessman Brian Coppin to invest $6 million without disclosing that Bond's own company stood to gain a $12 million success fee. The deal failed, the bank collapsed, investors lost more than $200 million. Bond was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. But even then, it wasn't over. In 1996, Bond was convicted again, this time for fraud. He had secretly sold an Edward Manet painting from Bond Corporation to his own private company at below market value, profiting personally while denying the company its share. The judge called it what it was: greed and grandiosity. Then came the most serious charge of all. In 1997, while already serving time, Bond pleaded guilty to what was then Australia's largest corporate fraud. It traced back to 1988. For the moment, his empire was running out of cash, and to one final desperate move: the Bell Group. The more than $1 billion Bond siphoned out of its subsidiary Bell Resources through those complex back-to-back loans and into his failing empire didn't belong to him and was never returned. Nearly $900 million of it poured into the failed takeover of Monroe, the same company that had publicly branded his empire insolvent. It was the same pattern he'd always followed: bigger bets, more risk, other people's money. But this time, he couldn't outrun it. He'd spent a lifetime betting big, as long as it was with someone else's money. This time, there was no one left to cover the loss. Alan Bond served just 3 years in prison. Convictions were overturned, charges collapsed, years of investigation, millions of documents, undone by appeals, legal technicalities, and questions around his health. Part of his sentence included a 5-year ban from directing Australian companies. But Bond had never been a man who stayed within boundaries, and he wasn't about to start now. In March 2000, he resurfaced in London. His next venture: Africa. Mining, oil, diamonds. High risk, high reward, and far from the scrutiny he had once faced at home. The structures were familiar: offshore entities, complex ownership, opaque deals. By 2008, Bond had reappeared on Australia's rich list, but the scale had changed. His fortune, estimated at $265 million, was only a shadow of what it once was. The empire was gone, the reputation never fully recovered. When Bond died on June 5th, 2015, aged 77, he left behind a legacy that refused to settle. On one hand, the man who helped deliver Australia's greatest sporting triumph. On the other, the architect of one of the largest corporate collapses in Australian history. A man who cost shareholders and lenders billions. Bond reached a place few ever do. Not just success, not just failure, but both, at the highest level. In the end, the same traits that built his empire were the ones that destroyed it.